All right, y'all ready to get started?
Yeah.
All right, so I think we left off somewhere close to here. We were talking about the different types of methods that we can use to measure soil water. We mentioned that we can take that soil core from the field, we can measure it wet, we'll measure it dry, we can subtract the water from that, and water weighs how much? 8 pounds per gallon. So because we know that, so that 8 pounds per gallon, if you remember from our mass of an acre furrow slice calculation, knows that 1 gram per cubic centimeter, the density of water, that is how we determine that water weighs 8 pounds per gallon. And that just takes everything else out of that equation. The most common you might run into would be a time domain reflectometry. Remember I mentioned about the scale that sends this electric signal throughout my body and measures how much fat and muscle and water content that I have, and that's all based on the movement of electromagnetic waves through my body, and they can measure the resistance to that. This is the apparatus. It looks just like a soil probe. Put it in the ground, hit the button, it sends a reading back, and then you can move on. They're fairly accurate because it's measuring the electricity and the conductance. If we needed to get more accurate, we would take it to a lab, which you will probably never get into. The other way is we have a field tensiometer where this kind of creates a vacuum. That soil moisture potential creates a vacuum in the soil, and we can measure that with a gauge. This is a kind of a standard thing in ag fields where we will have some sort of soil moisture sensor, and I'm going to be working with some people where we're going to try and have those soil moisture sensors set up on some kind of like a smartphone technology we call smart farm technology, where it measures the soil moisture potential and sends it back to a signal that goes into a big model that gets calculated and says, hey, you have about 3 days before you need to apply irrigation or you're going to lose X amount of yield. So that's kind of like some cutting edge technology moving forward, and it all happens on your phone. So that's kind of the future of agriculture, is that pretty soon we'll be farming from class. Pretty cool stuff. We talked about KSAT, which is measuring the hydraulic conductivity. Some of the factors that influence that are pore size, our structure, and so if we have no-till, the water forms that channel down and kind of makes a path for itself, and that water flow will be continuous. Now, come by, we had that for a couple years, and then we plow it up. Guess what? You start it all over. The water has to find a new route to get out of the field, and you run the risk of messing up your water flow through the soil. It could be good or bad, but you're running a risk when you do it. And it all depends on what time, like what the soil moisture is when you till, how aggressively you till, and what kind of implement that you use when you till. So like those are some types of things that producers are thinking about when they're trying to determine whether or not they want to till, or they're going to keep it as no-till. Do we just do strip till, where you're just kind of tilling just the row that you're going to plant in, and leave the rest of the soil undisturbed so that we can still get that drainage, but we break up that soil and allow for our roots to grow better. We can have some air that's trapped in there, and I guess in a couple of labs we'll be doing, we'll be adding some water to some soil and looking at dispersion. But if there's air trapped in there and you add water on top of it, the air can't go anywhere. And so it forms this like bubble. And guess what? The water's sitting on top of the bubble because the air can't get up above it. The soil's compact down so much that the water's trapped on the top and it can't go down. So having too much air in the bottom layers of your soil can influence your hydraulic conductivity. And then the preferential flow, and that's just, I was out with a student on Saturday taking some soil samples on a field, and there were furrows in the soil. So guess where the water's going to go? In the hole, right? But we also have those little small channels that are made by earthworms and maybe a beetle or some other soil bug or insect or whatnot, plants are going to make some channel, and then when they die, that channel is then left there. So there's all these little things that are kind of going along in the soil that can influence your water infiltration. This diagram is showing that a sandy soil, the water will typically just run straight down, much like when you go to the beach, right? Like the water doesn't spread out, it goes straight down. Because there's no pore space, and the water cannot, like, I guess, fill in and fill out. So in our clay soil, we have this first zone, this zone that is indicated by the blue that will fill up first. This zone has to fill up first, and then finally this light green one will begin to fill up, and once all these pores are saturated, we'll begin to have some finally penetrating and moving down into the soil profile. An unsaturated flow, this is kind of difficult to measure because the flow of the water is based on how strong the water is absorbed to the soil colloids, and that's going to go along with soil texture. So we don't really know the soil texture, and we can't really determine how well that's going to flow until we know the soil texture. This is dealing with that matrix potential, and so these are the adsorption forces of the soil and water. So we have a soil colloid, and based upon what type of colloid it is, or particle size, whether it's sand, silt, or clay, is going to determine what kind of attraction that particle has to that water molecule. So clays would have a greater attraction or affinity for that water because they have a higher charge. And there's also pore space. So more pore space, they're really kind of all crammed in there, right? We have very small particles and water filling in between those particles, and the attraction is going to be pulled on from all sides. Remember, clays have the greatest negative charge. So all those other things are going to go into it. Infiltration. So there's two things about that we can get kind of thrown off a little bit about which one is which. And so infiltration, if you can think about military, when you infiltrate the enemy's lines, you just break in, right? That would just be entering into the soil. Some influences going to be texture. The water would infiltrate a sandy soil quicker than it would a clay soil. Organic matter, structure. No-till versus till. When we have better soil structure, we have better water flow. Organic matter is what's going to hold on to the soil particles and help maintain that structure, kind of like concrete or webbing. There's a webbing in there that kind of holds that all together and keeps that soil from moving or rupturing or changing. Antecedent moisture content. So there's a balance between bone dry soil soaking up water. Y'all know the difference between hydrophobic and hydrophilic? No? Hydrophobic meaning doesn't like water. Hydrophilic meaning loves water. P-H-Y-L-L means love. And so, remember on Monday, that's how long ago it seems like Friday ago. What I mentioned about the sponge. So have you ever seen a sponge that's just been outside all day and it is literally bone dry? And you go to try and use it to wipe something up and it takes a minute for it to actually let the water absorb into its pore spaces. So bone dry soil it's going to take a minute for that water to infiltrate it because there are some hydrophobic properties to that soil that it's not ready to absorb that yet. Much like this is going to break. Much like the other way, if we have some moisture there, the rate of infiltration is not going to be as fast as if there was just a little. It's because that pore space is already filled up. There's nowhere for it to go. So if you have a little bit of antecedent moisture content, your infiltration rates will be just a little bit slower than if we had just kind of slightly above permanent wilting point. And who remembers what the pressure potential or the potential for permanent wilting point? When do we reach that? What you got, Nick? You're close. You got the bars, and it's negative.
-10 to -15.
Negative 10 to negative 50. You probably looked at it with the KPA scale. Negative 10 to negative 15 bars for our permanent wilting point. So if we were probably at like -5 bars, we'd probably have some pretty good infiltration. And then finally, temperature. And compaction. So warm soils would adsorb or have greater infiltration compared to cold soils. And that's just because there's a little bit of extra expansion when things get hot, right? That's really all it is. It's not anything major. It's not something that we could probably see and go, that's warm soil right there. But there is just a little bit of extra space, and I think this really goes with the gas laws, that there's just a little bit of extra space for that water to move into. But when it's cold, the air pressure around it is very small. And then finally, compaction, which is probably the most, right off the top of your head, the first thing you should think about when we think about infiltration is bulk density. And so as bulk density increases, what happens to the pore space? It decreases. And if we have decreased pore space, we can't fill it with water, can we? So as our bulk density increases or decreases, what happens to our pore space? It goes up. Right, so there's a fine line between tilling or driving a tractor in the same rows. Do we have to till the whole field, or maybe we can just till a certain section of it? Do we have to run the plow over it? I don't know, but if we keep running over in the same row, guess what happens to that one row? It gets compacted. We don't get any water infiltration. And if it doesn't go in the water, in the soil, guess where it goes? Where? Where does it go? Out the ditch. So if it's not in the soil, it's in the ditch. We don't want it in the ditch. We need it in the soil where our plants can get a hold of it. This is just kind of showing where that water vapor would move to. So it was going to move from moist to dry, because remember, we're trying to get from areas of greater concentration or content to areas of lower concentration or content. This is going back to the big tree chart that I showed that has all the way from the soil all the way back up to the air. There's not a lot of water in the air compared to the soil. Same principle. Now, percolation is the movement after it enters the soil profile. Two completely different things. Related, but different. And as I mentioned, infiltration is just getting into the very top, ½ inch of soil. Percolation is what happens after it enters the soil and moves through the soil profile. And this is known as KSAT. There are two sort of components to percolation. One is going to be the wetting front. And this is driven by gravity, because as water enters the soil, there's no pressure above it pushing it down. So something has to be pulling it through the soil profile. It has to make it through somewhere. And now, whether it's being pulled through by gravity or it's just going down naturally just because of with its own weight, it's moving because of gravity for the wetting front. Next, it will move down as saturated flow. This is going to be more matrix potential. This is the attraction of the soil colloids to say, I need water too. I need a piece of this water. I need some of that molecule. This is adhesion. And then the water moves behind it from cohesion. Did anybody need that last? Everyone good here? All right. So we have soil into the water. This is the wetting front. This is the direction that is moving because of gravity. This is going to be our saturated flow because it is moving to the side. You see we have here, I need to do this on the screen. Here's where our water enters. The wetting front, because water is going to be flowing over there as well. Water enters. This is the downward movement. This is the driven by gravity. And then this is the matrix potential. So wetting front and then saturated flow. And because those pore spaces are so close together, they need to fill up first. And so you'll have a matrix potential of the soil colloid saying, water come this way first. We have this attraction through adhesion and cohesion. Soon enough, we'll start to get a second wetting front. Once the pore space fills up here, we will start to move outward and then finally downward. So infiltration occurs right here. Water entering the soil. Percolation is the rest of it with our wetting front moving downward. And then our saturated flow being the matrix potential moving left to right or lateral. Does that make sense? Sarah looked at me and was like, It does though, like, I want to make sure I'm explaining that fairly simply. So we can have this problem where we have stratified soils, and this could be based on topography, or it could be how much sand or silt or clay would be in some bank that overflows. But here we see the wetting front. We have the wetting front of this water. So here is infiltration, here is percolation, and then wetting front, saturated flow, moving and filling up the pore space in the silt lump. So finer textured soils, greater pore space. The water has to fill that pore space up first before it can move into the next layer. And that happens up to a certain point. Like, we can only hold so much in the soil against gravity before gravity takes over. And so we have this silt loam over the sand. We have to fill all of this pore space up first before it moves into this sand. So the depth of the soil and the layers are going to also influence how that water moves in your soil. So that's why it's important to take soil samples like we're going to do today. Because you can at least get an idea of what it is like for at least 1 foot of your soil, and you can tell whether or not you're going to have good water flow or not. And that's ultimately going to determine on whether or not you're going to support this producer and working for Farm Bureau and saying, we'll insure your crop, and you're trying to grow rice on a sandbar. It's not going to happen. And these are things that you might talk with a soil scientist about, or your agronomist, or your extension agent. It's going to affect the depth of the impermeable layer, your rooting characteristics, and in potted plants, the size of the container, so how much the space for your roots to grow into. And so there are 3 routes that plants can take water up through their roots. Number 1 is going to be capillary movement. And that is that the water closest to the plant will make its way into the small pore space. And then that water moves from a less negative area to a more negative area. And so this is going back to that large diagram of the tree, that the potential in the plant is more negative than the potential in the soil. And that's just a kind of a diffusion into the plant, just because there's less water in the plant. If we were balanced, if there was just as much water in the plant as there was in the soil, and those potentials were the same, there would be no water movement. There would be no need for it. Water can be taken up just through contact with the soil water. What happens is that at some point in time, if we reach permanent wilting point, the plants will shrink because there's no water filling it up like a balloon. The roots will shrivel, and then now we don't have that root to soil contact. And now this isn't like you can go out and actually see that the plants aren't touching the soil. This is like electron microscope type stuff where you're really seeing that the space is nanometers or picometers or something like that. And then also, if we have soils high in 2-to-1 shrink swell clays, like smectite or montmorillonite, the soil will expand, but then it will shrink. So it might make it to the plant root and kind of encase it, but then when it shrinks, it will back off of it a little bit. And then finally, root extension. And this is just plants growing towards the water. The 3 routes are going to be capillary movement, root to soil contact, and then root extension, which is going to increase our root to soil contact. Making sense? This is a picture describing the previous slide where we have our root growing through our soil. We have pore space, macro and micro, and the water has filled that up, and now the root is surrounded by water. Water will move in from the soil into the root and in these cells, finally into the xylem, and then up to the leaves. And those tubes are going to be very small, so the water is going to rise just from adhesion and cohesion. Plus, we also have matrix, we have that water pressure or water potential that is also working, where water moves from areas of from high concentration to low concentration. That's fine, it does get backwards, but it moves from high concentration. There's not enough water in the plant, and the plant is constantly expending water because it's moving up the xylem into the atmosphere, area of lowest concentration. Well, when the water is either used up or drained out, and we're now getting close to permanent wilting point, we don't have as much root to soil contact. And look, we also have this layer of air right here. And so the plant is still sucking like a straw. It is still trying to get water. That matrix potential is still pulling something into the plant. And if you pull water into the plant, it's good. But if you pull air into the plant, it's not. It'd be just the same thing as if we got an air bubble in our bloodstream. Y'all know anything about that? You know that's deadly, right? If you get an air bubble in your bloodstream, it's called embolism. And you will die. So we get to permanent wilting point, the plant is still trying to take in water, but there's nothing there but air. So it's taking in air, not water. It gets an embolism, it cannot recover, and then your plant dies. So we always want to make sure that we're keeping at least enough water in our soils to ensure that there's some water movement rather than air movement into the plant. Anybody have any questions about any of this stuff? I mean, no? Ready to get moving and get done. All right, we're going to move into the hydrologic cycle. Some of you may have seen this before. Again, I don't know that I got it in the notes or not. I don't think so. I think I ended with just a cross section. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of writing to do. But just that we have water coming up from the oceans, evaporates into the atmosphere. When we get too much water in the atmosphere, it rains. The water eventually makes its way back to the ocean, evaporates, moves, rains, evaporates, moves. So, and the thing about these cycles is that matter cannot be created or destroyed. So the water is still the same amount of water that is on the earth today is roughly about the same amount of water that was on the earth 10,000 years ago. It didn't go anywhere. It just changed phases. It might be more vapor because our temperature has increased. Could be we're getting more water because the temperature increase is now melting the polar ice caps. But the same amount of water is still there. So watersheds are going to be an area, kind of like a bowl, that all the water drains into the lowest elevation. This is a look at all of the different watersheds that are in Tennessee. I think we are the South Fork and Cumberland River, somewhere in that area. I'm not from Tennessee, so if I'm wrong, please let me know. Is that about where we're at? We're in the Caney Fork River watershed? All right, that's where we are then, in the Caney Fork River watershed. All of these watersheds eventually run to the Gulf of Mexico. These are a look at some of the regions across the whole country. I guess we have our mountains right here, which kind of separates the west and the east. We will start up here in Minnesota, and everything drains out to the Gulf of Mexico. Either through here, and then finally there. So, just, ma'am?
I'm talking to Sam.
Okay. Sometimes you need expert advice, I get it. But also something that's a big problem with this is that all the farming and all the fertilizer that gets applied and all the watersheds above us, we end up having to pay some of the consequences for. Because that nitrogen finally makes it out to the bottom of the Mississippi, and we have this hypoxia zone. And this hypoxia zone, right here is showing the oxygen levels, red being the lowest, and then blue being the highest. So that nitrogen is left into that water. It takes the oxygen out of the water, and then the fish die. That's the long and the short of that. But it all comes from all of these other watersheds that have production, that have soil loss, that have runoff that contains nutrients that end up making it to the bottom of the Mississippi. There is a water balance equation that is probably used more in watershed management than it would be in this class. But to understand that there's going to be that soil does account for some component of this model. And so that's why knowing our soil moisture content helps us determine what our water balance is in our watershed. Precipitation is pretty straightforward. That's going to be the rainfall. We have ways of measuring the evapotranspiration. We can go out and take our soil samples and we can measure the moisture content, maybe with our time domain reflectometry. And then there's going to be some discharge. You probably need to know this. There are 5 fates of precipitation. One is going to be interception. And not like in football. Well, maybe a little like football. Next we have infiltration. So whatever doesn't get intercepted by plant leaves or buildings or roads or something like that is going to infiltrate into our soil. Whatever does not infiltrate the soil is going to run off. Whatever does infiltrate the soil will be held there for a moment until our pressure potentials take over, gravity, matrix, and start pulling that soil through pulling that water through the soil profile, and then finally that enters our groundwater. But look at the bottom. It's depending on the timing of the rainfall, how much rainfall, and the form of precipitation. So when I think about precipitation, what are the 2 types y'all think of? Rain and snow. But snow, like the snow we just had, stuck around for a couple of days, right? Well, that water likely infiltrated the soil in a very uniform manner because it melted in a very uniform manner, right? But what about when we get a thunderstorm? What happens to most of that water? It runs off because the infiltration rate is less than the rainfall rate. The infiltration rate may only be a ½ an inch per hour, and it rained 2. So the rest of that water ran off. And if it ran off, what part of this equation are we not filling up? There's a couple of them actually. How about on the bottom? Soil storage. And so the rainfall rates haven't really changed over the past, like the amount of precipitation. If you were to go to NOAA or some weather data, it would tell you that we're still getting about 50 or 60 inches of rain per year, but our groundwater levels, the aquifers are being depleted faster than we can get water to them. Because it rains so fast and so hard and so quick that the water runs off and doesn't actually filter through the soil. Also that we use soil as a filter, so the water that is in the lake has now not as clean as that which filtered all the way through the soil and then entered into the aquifer. And we're using that groundwater to grow crops with, rather than drinking. So there are going to be 3 components to interception. Do you have anybody in forestry, wildlife and fisheries or anything like that? Yeah? This is going to be your time, brother. All right. Have stem flow, through fall, and canopy drift. Stem flow, through fall, canopy drift. Anyone have plant science? How long ago did y'all have it? Did y'all have Miss Mahan for that? Yeah. So she went over some of this stuff, didn't she? This is where it comes into play. This is where the leaf type and the architecture of the canopy. Whether we have a very thin leaf or whether we have a very broad round leaf. Is it concave? Is it going to hold on to some water? And how those leaves are positioned on the plant. And how the plant structure is, and do we have just single branches, are they on top of each other? How is that going to influence the water that makes it to the ground? Wind speed and radiation and temperature are all going to influence our transpiration and evapotranspiration, and that is going to pull that out of the soil. And humidity is going to influence how much water actually leaves the plant. So there is a boundary layer. If my arm is a leaf, there's a boundary layer. It's just like when we sweat. If there's a reason why we sweat, it's because the water, like the vapor pressure, the humidity above our arms and our bodies is greater than the water can come out of it. Like in Arizona, they don't have any humidity, so the water comes out of their skin and just evaporates immediately. Anybody been to Arizona in the summertime? Still hot, isn't it? Hot's hot. 115 is still 115. I don't care if it's humid or not. But we don't have the sweat because it evaporates very quickly because it's so hot and there's no humidity. So that's going to influence interception as well. So stem flow is going to be when the water hits the tree and it flows down the stem. Pretty basic concept. But look where most of that water goes though. Most of that water is going right by the base of the tree. We have interception by the leaves. It is going to run down the branches, and then we have a large wetting front right here. Not so much water infiltrating right here under the yellow, and then finally we will have more on the outside. Can anyone think of why deciduous trees would have more stem flow than coniferous trees? Deciduous being like oak trees, coniferous trees being like pine trees. Correct. They capture more water. Looks like an umbrella. It covers more area, so it will intercept more of the water. Coniferous trees are very kind of straight up. It's only going to connect, it's only going to capture this much area of the rainfall. The rest of it's going to actually make it to the ground. Throughfall is going to be what actually makes it through the leaves and actually reaches the surface underneath the tree. Again, that is going to vary with vegetation type. So which one would you expect to have more throughfall? A deciduous tree or a coniferous tree? A coniferous tree, because the leaves are very thin, right? And there's a lot of open space for that water to fall through. And then finally, canopy drip. This is along the edge of the canopy. And so our roots of our trees stick out 1.5 times the edge of the canopy. And this is how they get their water. They are still able to capture some of this water. After it makes it through to the soil, we have infiltration. Remember, infiltration is just getting into the soil, and after that, we're into percolation. Gravity is going to be like our wetting front. Capillary action is also going to go along with our matrix potential. It is also where the roots are going to be able to absorb some of that water. And our soil porosity, which is going to go along with texture, is going to determine how much water will infiltrate the soil. Texture, structure, bulk density, and organic matter content, you'll probably end up answering at least 4 more times over the next module. And these are going to be the primary things when we think about water. Texture is going to influence our pore space, how the structure is, the compaction, and the organic matter content in order to keep our structure together and to also absorb some of that water. So when I start asking you questions about what soil properties do you think are going to influence water movement, texture, organic matter, bulk density, structure, porosity, things like that are going to be the answers. This is going to be the last one. As we mentioned earlier, that when the rainfall rate is greater than the infiltration rate, the water has to go somewhere. It's going in the ditch and not in your field. And so there are some things that we can do to slow that water movement down. We want to make sure that our ground is covered. We want to minimize tillage so that we can get better infiltration rates. We can, when we minimize tillage, we also have crop residues that are left that are going to slow the movement of water out of our field. That is going to help give more time for the water to infiltrate. We can create buffer strips that are going to slow the water before it leaves out of the field. Terraces and strip cropping and things of that nature. All right, so we're going to meet at the lab, and we're just going to go out on the quad to take soil samples today, okay? That way we're not all trying to drive all the way out to the farm and have to make it all the way back to a class. One day we will make it out to the farm to do this for real, but today we're just going to meet in the lab, we'll go over soil sampling, then we're going to walk out onto the quad and we're going to get some practice before we go do the real big one. We're going to put all these concepts together, okay? Sound good? Cool. We'll catch you all in a couple hours.